We are losing a narrative which has guided humankind since its beginning. It's the narrative that you are here, you owe your existence also to prepare a better future. If you go back to the agricultural society, even to the beginnings during the whole time of the industrial society, there was this drive to create a better world for the future. Today, with all the crises which we have, with the multitude of problems we are confronted with, I think we have become much more egocentric on an individual and also on a national way. And I think we have to think about how we recreate this narrative.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us today is Professor Klaus Schwab. He is the founder of the World Economic Forum. He's got a couple of books out, a couple of brilliant books, Thriving and Leading in the Intelligent Age, Longevity and Retirement in the Intelligent Age. Of course, we can learn a lot from the professor on both of these subjects. It's an honor to have you. You've spent your life bringing together leaders from business, politics, and science, and civil society. But before we discuss the book, The Intelligent Age, tell us a little bit about your origin story and a little bit about the formation of the World Economic Forum, which has become this brilliant platform for leaders and diplomacy. And, you're one of the people that generationally has furthered the peace process, sir. But let's talk about the origin. And let's talk about the idea that you came up with and why.
No, Anthony, I had a very good and fast professional development in my young ages as a professor. I was the youngest professor in Switzerland, but also in business and in public affairs. And I wrote the book. I was asked to write the book by the German Business Association on management and on the modern management. And I was thinking about the purpose, and I actually described for the first time what is called today the stakeholder concept. And it was at a time when, of course, you had Milton Friedman presenting his views that the business of business is business. I felt no, business has also social responsibility. So I wrote the book, it was a success, and then I felt I should create a foundation to promote the stakeholder concept. And that was the origin of Davos. And of course, I never dreamt that out of an idea, a very impactful organization would come out. I'm very grateful for the support I had by so many of our partners and so on, who embraced this philosophy.
Klaus, a half a century ago, the world was deeply divided by ideology. You had the Cold War, you had the tension with China, Russia, the United States, Western powers in general. How were you able to thread that needle and bring these people together at that time? What were some of the thoughts that you had there?
I think despite all the differences, there is always the need to exchange ideas, even if you are in a controversial situation. So what I created was a platform which was based on open dialogue, but also on showing mutual respect. And that was the basic principle. It worked already in the Cold War time. Particularly, we played a big role in the reunification of Germany, in the integration of Eastern and Western Europe, and so on, and also in other parts of the world. So that was the secret, to really provide a trusted platform for dialogue.
I've been to I was just going back through my career. I originally got introduced to you by Michael Dell, who was on your board. Michael's one of my early investors, and I started going to the World Economic Forum in 2007. I've also came with you to China on more than one occasion, and I've never left the forum without learning something, meeting new friends, having a good time. Tell us a little bit about the editorial process. When you step back and think each year of the programming of something like this, what were some of the thoughts that drove the editorial decisions?
No, you are right. Davos, I think, was successful because it was not just a platform, a transactional platform for business or for meeting government people. It always, in my opinion, had to serve as a compass, a intellectual compass and a moral compass. So I spend a lot of time to figure out what the future will bring and to put it on the program of Davos. And we created also some new concepts, like the concept of social entrepreneurship, the concept of public-private partnership, which was not very well known, or I take also this notion of the fourth industrial revolution, which I coined, where I said we have to prepare ourselves, and it was already 2016, for a completely new era, where artificial intelligence and other technologies will completely change our lives.
I've directly benefited from that. Let's go to the book, Thriving and Leading in an Intelligent Age. It reflects decades of engagement with these leaders across a lot of different sections. But once again, mankind, womankind, we're at a crossroads again where we have human and artificial intelligence that's going to deeply impact the political world and the economic world. When you look at this now, what is your message? What is your synthesizing message for world leaders, both business and political?
I think we have to go back 200 years. And 200 years ago, we had the transition of the agricultural era into the industrial era. So we suddenly had locomotives, we had electricity, and so on and so on. Now, I would say the change which is happening now is as serious and as impactful as it was in the transition from the agricultural to the industrial age. So I wanted to coin an expression for it. It's not just artificial intelligence, it's also quantum computing, it's life sciences and so on, which will completely change our lives. So I feel similar to the transition we had 200 years ago, we have now a life-changing, system-changing transition from the industrial age to the intelligent age. And it will affect all aspects of political, economic, social, technological, and also environmental dimensions.
I feel like this age of AI is not fully understood. And when I read your writing, I feel you have a good grasp on it. So tell me, in your opinion, Klaus, what is misunderstood about this evolution that's taking place right now?
What concerns me most is, of course, we use now agent AI to provide us with advice. And in many ways, we start to make our lives dependent on agent AI. So, for example, you have now agent AI which communicates with you, provides you with advice if you have serious mental problems. And what concerns me and what not disturbs me, there's always a positive and a negative side, but ultimately, what is behind the algorithm should reflect our human nature. And you have seen in the book, I insist again and again that actually we should use the evolution of the artificial intelligence as a reminder or as a wake-up call for what actually it means to be human. If human doesn't mean anymore to be intelligent, then we have to define humanity in different ways. It's in terms of empathy, it's in terms of love, and so on. So we have to make sure that when we create those agents, we integrate those dimensions so that the effect is a positive one and not a destructive one.
Let me ask a follow-up question directly related to this, Klaus. The super intelligence is upon us. It's imminent. Is it 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And of course, describing super intelligence as being something exponential for these computers in terms of their ability to pick up information and to potentially end up controlling things. What what do you say about that? What are your concerns there, and how can we allay those concerns?
We can avoid the negative aspects, which means to be dominated by the machine, by building into the algorithm, into the machine learning process, into the data, the necessary protective measures. My big concerns at the moment is that we are not able to do so. The world, I put it into a broader context at this moment, is so absorbed by what we call a multi-crisis. And when we look around, what are politicians doing? What are, to a certain extent, also the leaders of companies and society? We are not sufficiently thinking anymore long term. So my big fear is that we do not, in time, create the necessary protection for those new technologies, or against those new technologies.
You've experienced this your entire life. You have allies and adversaries globally. We've got the good guys and the bad guys, Klaus. We both know that. There's a combination of them in our lives. How do you prevent the bad guys from doing nefarious things with AI?
I think there's no, let's say, unfortunately, no recipe which is generally valid. But I have for me the notion of constructive optimism. That's one of my life principles, which means you have to believe that the future will be better than today. But then you also have to make sure that it is better than today. So you have to take a constructive attitude. But the problem is today, everything is integrated into a system with many different dimensions, political, economic, social, and so on. So you need actually cooperation. You have to bring the different stakeholders together to determine those guidelines, those protective measures which we need. So and dialogue related to the truth is not to, let's say, what we believe only. We have to first establish the truth, and then we have to have dialogue and to find the optimal solution, not in our individual interest, but in the interest of the collective. And, and here, Anthony, if I may add, my next book will actually be restoring truth and trust in the intelligent age.
I think it's very important, and also the checks and balances that you describe are also usually important because we still have the power to control those things.
Exactly. Still it's important because it evades us slowly.
Yeah, exactly. We don't want it to get ahead of ourselves. I want to go to one of the central themes of the book, which you described as purpose driven leadership. And so, you know, it's just a fascinating question. I've always been dying to ask you this, and so I want to ask it to you now. What distinguishes leaders? You've met so many different leaders over the course of your career, Klaus, political, business, civic, academic. You know right away when someone's a purpose-driven leader or when some person is a transactionalist. So what distinguishes these people and what are some of the cues?
Of course, I have also taught leadership for 32 years at university and have read tons of books about leadership. But for me, it comes down to a very simple concept. And I describe it in the following way. A true leader has soul, brain, heart, muscles, and nerves. So you may ask, what is it nonsense? No. The soul stands for purpose. And And actually, purposing includes also a value-driven vision, how you want to shape the future. That's the soul. But then you need the brain, you need intelligence, and today you need particularly systemic intelligence to bring all the ends together. And then you have to have the heart. Today, you need empathy. You have to be respected, not only to be respected, people have to feel a connection with the leader. Finally, you need muscles because you have to translate your vision and your purpose into action. And ultimately, you need nerves. You need good nerves. You need resilience. And for me, what is important, a true leader, he may not excel in each of those, but he needs each of those dimensions. We have a tendency usually to see someone who excels in one of those five dimensions and then to be very impressed. But my experience of life is there is no leader which doesn't incorporate at least a significant level in each of those five dimensions.
It's such a good statement, and it does tie into the other book, which I want to ask you about as well, which is the longevity and retirement in an intelligent age. And I will say this, Klaus, you're a role model of mine because I feel like your best days are ahead of you, Klaus. I mean, you're as vibrant and as energetic as ever before. And so, tell me what the secret is.
The secret, I think, is always to be curious and to have a positive attitude towards life. Anthony, like everybody, I also went through some challenges in my life. And I have now the principle never lose time with something which is negative, because it doesn't help you. So I think that's the foremost secret. And of course, to have, to a certain extent, a disciplined life. Of course, I like my wine and I like from time to time whiskey. But in principle, I know you like wines, but the general attitude is to have a certain life discipline.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I mean, one of our personal stories together, which I'm going to share here on our podcast, is that when President Trump was elected to the presidency, you actually reached out to me, and I brought you over to Trump Tower to meet him. I think it was the first time you had the opportunity to meet him, and of course, now he's a frequent attender to the World Economic Forum. Will be coming again this year, and I had a unceremonious firing from there. But like you, I took things in stride. So give some life coaching here, Klaus, for people that go through ups and downs in their lives. What do they need to do to maintain that positivity?
I think what is important if you are in such a situation, not to spend too much time on what worries you. So to find immediately another challenge. And for me, whenever I was in such a situation, I started to write a new book. So my present energy in writing, let's say, several books in a relatively short time, comes from two angles. First, it helps me to overcome challenges which I may have had, and second, I think we speak a lot about artificial intelligence, about the intelligent age, and we do it relatively in a abstract way. So what I want to do with this series now, looking at retirement, then at I have another book in preparation looking at universities in the intelligent age. What I want to do is to provide general people with a practical knowledge how they can master this transition into a completely different world.
Makes sense. I'm a big admirer of Warren Buffett, turning 95. I'm an admirer of yours, and there's
Only
not
87, so
you're only 87. You're my mom's age, Klaus, and she's as sharp as you, Klaus. Trust me, She's still my boss, Klaus. Okay, so my question to you though is a little bit of a different angle because you have to continue to learn. There's a neuroplasticity about you, and so how do you what do you recommend to people in terms of their reading, in terms of their interaction with others? I mean, you've done such a great job of this over your life, so impart some wisdom here.
No, I think today with artificial intelligence, you can satisfy your curiosity much faster. So if I compare myself with 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I'm much more sitting behind my desktop or my iPad and looking at issues, um, and which I didn't understand in my life, and now I get them explained in a very convincing and reasonable way, and I find it fascinating. I learn about things I never would have thought of to become not a specialist, but just take, for example, the issue of retirement. I had to look at the financial issues. I did not know about any medical aspect of longevity, so I had to do a lot of research, and I did it all via artificial intelligence, and I learned a lot. And that's a great satisfaction because you feel when you get older, you don't diminish your knowledge level, but you increase your knowledge level. And that's maybe also the hope for the future, because artificial intelligence might provide us with the means to really individually and collectively to enter a new age of creativity. I would nearly call it a new renaissance.
Yeah, and yeah, and listen, I mean, that's our hope, and that's also the all of that innovation will lead to great economic progress and hopefully economic abundance. But in my reading of your work, there's a clear moral thread, and I'm going to make a statement and either agree or disagree. But I feel like you're saying to us, progress must be inclusive, it must be ethical, it must be humane, and you've dedicated a lifetime to this sort of cooperation. So the question, sir, is what worries you most about this global moment and the time that we're living in?
I think that we are losing a narrative which has guided humankind since its beginning. It's the narrative that you are here and you owe your existence also to prepare a better future. If you go back to the agricultural society, even to the beginnings during the whole time of the industrial society, there was this drive to create a better world for the future. Today, with all the crises which we have, with the multitude of problems we are confronted with, I think we have become much more egocentric on a individual and also on a national way. That makes international cooperation so much more difficult, by the way. And I think we have to think about how we recreate this narrative. And here, I have to say I'm quite optimistic. I have created also what I call this Global Shapers community, a special foundation which has now over 10,000 young leaders in its community and in over 500 cities around the world. And every time I'm traveling and I meet those young leaders, I'm going out and I'm impressed. We are today in a situation where we have to learn much more from the young. And I give you an example. If I have a problem, I'm with my technical devices. I'm not going anymore to a specialist. I go to my grandson, and he has a solution. Let's say real time. So my message is: let's believe into the future. But in order to believe into the future, we have to keep in mind the, the collective. We are always part of a community. We are not alone. And if we want to prosper, we have to take into account that the other people around us prosper also. I know it's a platitude and it's a commonplace to say, but there are many practical steps you can take in order to make this objective a reality.
Yes, I agree. So let's take this new generation, Klaus, that you and I are not a part of. Let's take the generation that has been born after the millennium turn. So the year 2000. These people are now 25. What's the message for these young people?
It's when we look at the future of those young people, I always think of my grandson, which was, of course, born after 2000. And if I take the life expectancy and I take some assumptions which seem to be very valid, he will still be alive when we enter the 22nd century. So a long time from now. Um, so we have to create a future keeping in mind uh, how will actually this future look like. And here, of course, technology comes in again, because what we are seeing now is this fourth revolution, or I call it the intelligent age. I think, and it's not only artificial intelligence, it's all the other dimensions. Um, it and I come back to my belief, it may be trivial, we have to make sure that as we used in a certain way the industrial revolution to bring billions of people out of poverty, that was a positive effect. Of course, there were negative effects. So we have to think, how can we use this technological revolution to create even an uplifting again for humankind? And here, the young people can play a big role, but we have to integrate them already now into this process.
I think it's beautifully stated. I'm I feel like globalism, Klaus. I feel like globalism has gotten a bad name. I feel like people have used the internet and they've used propaganda to hurt the cause of globalism. But when you step back and look at a globalizing society, we have lifted billions of people out of poverty, and we've also helped to what you've dedicated your whole life to. We've helped to bring people together and to not dehumanize each other. And so when we're in each other's presence, we realize how much more we have in common with each other as opposed to what we have against each other from a tribal perspective. And so I applaud you for doing that and the dedication that you've had with this cause throughout your life. So we're at the end of this podcast. So what my producer and I did is we took 5 words, Klaus, and I'm gonna say the word, and then I would like you to come up with 1 or 2 sentences. It's sort of a raw shot test of your work. Okay, you ready?
Yes,
Okay. And so the first word, I'm gonna say the word leadership, and you think of what?
leadership is stewardship, and stewardship for what? For nature and the other human beings.
Okay. I say the word longevity, and what do you think of?
A reasonable conducting of your life
Peace. Say the word peace.
to honor mutual respect and to sit together and to find the common ground.
Okay, this is your life's work here. The fourth word is 3 words. World Economic Forum. I say those 3 words. I say the WEF. You say what?
It's a necessity for the modern world to have a platform where all stakeholders of global society could meet.
It's so true, Klaus. But you were the visionary for that. You were the one that got that in place over a half a century ago. Okay, this is the last word. and I'm going to give you the last word. It's actually two words. I say Klaus Schwab. You say what?
I would say a hopefully, um, uh, you embarrass me with this question. I would say it should be more than a legacy. It should be a compass, a moral, and maybe I'm not modest enough here, but it should be a moral and intellectual compass for the future.
Well, listen, I put you on the spot there because that's how I see you. And the title of these two books, it's the Intelligent Age series, but the title of these two books are Thriving and Leading in an Intelligent Age, Longevity and Retirement in an Intelligent Age. They're both written by Professor Klaus Schwab, who's the founder of the World Economic Forum and so many other things, and somebody I consider a friend. And I'm very grateful to you for the relationship that you and I have had over the years. And I've learned a lot from you and from the forum. And so thank you so much for joining us on Open Book here today.
Thank you, Anthony. You were always also a role model of a very engaged person in our activity.
You could get more economic innovation from free speech. You know, we've learned psychologically if we teach our children to speak freely, they innovate. They go on and create Facebook or they make Apple Computer. If we inhibit their free speech, then these countries have a tendency to need to steal intellectual property. Why the insecurity about the openness? It's a vibrant, dynamic economy. We've learned that more innovation comes from liberalism. What am I getting wrong?
If I wanted to defend some of the aspect of illiberalism, maybe I would say that maybe the Silicon Valley model of innovation is wrong. You know, the Silicon Valley approach is that maybe the way to get innovation is that we take Steve Jobs, we throw him into a garage, we send some LSD after him, and somehow an Apple computer comes out of the garage. But, you know, someone actually had to make that Apple computer. And that Apple computer, that iPhone, isn't being made in the US anymore. All of it is being made in China. And so they are kind of able to wait for American entrepreneurs to dream up really big ideas, something like Elon Musk or whatever. They kind of learn these big ideas. They sort of guess that American companies are no longer very good at building these ideas because over the last 25, 30 years, the American manufacturing base has mostly rusted. It's been a lot of failures in aviation, as well as the semiconductors, as well as manufacturing broadly. And then they just wait for the geniuses to kind of hand over these great ideas into the public, and then they count on Chinese manufacturing prowess to climb all of these ladders that the Americans are laying out for them.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us today is Dan Wang. The title of the book is Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And I was saying to Professor Wang here that I got this book from Neil Ferguson, Dan. I guess he's at the Hoover Institute with you, maybe. He said, listen, you got to read this book. I read the book, loved it. Thank you for joining the show. But before we get into the book, let's talk about you. Tell us a little bit about your background. We know that you're a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover History Lab, and you're now a best-selling author, but tell us how you got there.
Yeah, well, I'm having a great time at Hoover, especially when I can be surrounded by generous colleagues like Professor Ferguson and giving you my book. So this book sort of came together from after I spent about 6 years living in China between 2017 to 2023 when I was a technology analyst at an investment research firm, thinking about China's rise in semiconductors and clean technology and manufacturing broadly. And so this was a time of Donald Trump's first trade war, in which he was launching tariffs on China. This was a time when Chinese technology firms were getting more competent. This is a time when Xi Jinping was darkening its repression of all sorts of political practices. And I really thought that, you know, we need to move beyond these 19th century political science terms like capitalist or socialist or neoliberal to describe these two big countries. After being in China, I moved to be a fellow at the Yale Law School's Pulsar China Center. And after thinking about, you know, China as a country that is pretty autocratic and also very much ruled by engineers, I moved back to the U.S., which is so much more ruled by lawyers. And so that sort of set up a lot of the motivations for writing this book.
It's an interesting. I mean, I feel like I'm one of these uneducated Americans. I've spent some time in China, didn't fully understand it. I think the Americans looked at China as a manufacturing oasis, but didn't realize that this serpentine government would come in and take the engineering prowess and take the technology from companies like Apple and others that started manufacturing in China. And so tell us a little bit about the speed of growth in China and the success that they've had in terms of what they would call a technology transfer, but then also the strain. What made you realize that this was historically unprecedented about China?
Yeah, well, the economic growth of pulling 1.4 billion people out of extreme poverty, a few hundred million people into the middle class, and a few million people into the global elites. I mean, that is, I think, one of two central facts about China's rise over the last few decades. The other central fact is that it is a pretty authoritarian power that is very authoritarian into the 21st century, which means it has access to all of these technologies in which and intrusions in which to really impede on people's liberties and privacies. And so both facts are really important. And I think it is totally central to China's rise that it has mastered manufacturing, that it's mastered a lot of aspects of technological production. They're now in the global lead of things like automotives and clean technology and 100 other fields, and that is, impinging on a lot of traditional American competences.
Dan, I feel like we got this so wrong. I feel like 30 years ago, our elites in this country thought they won the Cold War, and they thought that by letting China into the World Trade Organization, China would move our way in terms of Western liberalism and in terms of Western freedoms. But they actually went in a different direction. They took the technology to do exactly what you said as more of a form of repression and social control. So how did we get it so first of all, is that statement correct? And if it is, how did we get it so wrong in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think that statement is correct. I think that there was this expectation that China would have liberal democracy after it has liberal markets, and that turned out to have been the wrong call. Now, I wasn't making these calls. Anthony, were you in the room making some of these calls?
No,
At least,
I wasn't making the calls, but let me tell you how bad I am at this.
yeah, tell me.
I thought those were the right calls. If you had said to me, the 29, 30-year-old version of me, when these calls were being made, the 35-year-old version of me when China entered the World Trade Organization in 1999, and you said to me as a pundit or as a Wall Street observer, was this the right call? I would have said yes. So I would have, even though I wasn't in the room, Dan, I would have gotten it wrong, and so I'm just trying to understand why we got it so wrong, myself included, by the way.
Yeah, well, I think if I were in the room, 10-year-old me, I also would have gotten it wrong. But I think that, maybe a lot of this was more
You didn't
motivated.
have to rub that in, Wang. You didn't have to rub in
I'm
how
sorry,
much
man.
younger you are than me.
I'm sorry,
Jesus.
man. You got
All
more
right,
hair, so it's
keep
all
going.
good.
Keep going. All right, it was a good
So
comeback, good recovery.
I think that, I think that this was more of a strategy. This is more of a hope than a strategy. That people were reasoning from these economic fundamentals that as China grew richer, the population would necessarily want more democracy. The internet was going to break down, all of China's walls. That everything really looked like it was on America's side. That this was also a moment of hubris because America did more or less vanquish the Soviet Union, or maybe it's more accurate to say that the Soviet Union mostly self-imploded. But all of these things sort of turned into a moment when everybody believed that something like someone like Bill Clinton would lead the world into the ultimate nirvana of total globalization. That turned out to have been wrong. That was more of a hope than a strategy, and I think that main question now is how do we course correct, given that China is now very much powerful and very much not liberal.
I wanna go to the triumphant part of this story. I want you to be a Chinese politician, a Chinese bureaucrat. You're a member of the Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army. Uh, the last 25 years have been successful, yes or no?
Mostly yes, although there are greater strains because over the last couple of years, there's much more political uncertainty, there is slower economic growth, and there are more social problems, but mostly a giant success.
And so a result of which, though, does this make you, because this is what happens to people, we make some good decisions, we get those decisions right, and then we get overconfident. And I'll give a Western example. We make 40-year decisions about containment, the wall comes down, we get very, very smug, and then we make a series of very arrogant decisions.
I think that, I think this goes to my fundamental view about the US and China over the longer term. I think that the competition between the US and China will go on for a very long time. That there is no, way that we can really understand this competition through these structural factors like, let's say, demography or geography. These are insufficient because I think that competition is dynamic. I think that the country that is going to be ahead is going to make mistakes out of overconfidence. And the country that's behind is really going to feel the need to catch up. And so you gave me an example of American overconfidence. Let me reply with an example of Chinese overconfidence. I was living in China in 2021. I was living in Beijing when Xi Jinping decided that he had the COVID pandemic under control, that you know the transition from Trump to Biden looked really chaotic after January 6th. And this was a moment for him to do big things. And so, what did Xi Jinping decide to do? Well, he kind of crushed the property sector. And then he also smacked around a lot of tech entrepreneurs like Jack Ma. And China's economy today is really weak precisely because of these two actions that he undertook about 4 or 5 years ago. And so, I think that these are the sort of things where they're really trying to catch up now. But once they do, they're also going to make mistakes of overconfidence again. So that's why the competition will last a really long time.
Okay, so explain to me the vision, though, because I want to understand this. I've got one point, I want to be Chinese, and I want to be a communist. I have 1.4 billion people that am in the country. I want to be in total control of them, and I want to censor the media, and I want to suppress their free speech, and then I also want to use technology to get them to conform to whatever the social standards are that I would like them to conform to. And if they don't do that, I'll find ways to penalize them, either using you know, a stable coin that's in renminbi or something like that, and take it from them, uh, and what is the theory behind that? Why is that, in my mind, ultimately gonna be successful?
I think that you've identified about half of the program, which is this, agenda of political control and coercion, really to keep the people in check. But I think that the Communist Party also has another half to its agenda, which is to deliver to people what they think that what they believe that the people ought to want. And so, if you're living in a Chinese city or the Chinese countryside, you're getting a lot of new subway stations. You're getting a lot of new parks. You're getting cleaner air. You're getting high-speed rail. You're getting new bridges and new sorts of infrastructure to connect you to the rest of the country and potentially the rest of the world. And a lot of that is being built by the engineers who run Beijing because they think that having these really big monumentalist projects like a giant dam or a giant bridge is going to really impress the people. I think sometimes that's true. I think that, the US used to impress the population with something like the Brooklyn Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge or the Hoover Dam, whatever it is. But, when you combine this element of coercion with an agenda that very plausibly, is improving people's lives. And then you have the propaganda authorities pointing out to various problems in the West, whether that's, crime in Europe or whether that is, political violence in the U.S. or whatever else. They can kind of plausibly claim to the people that the Communist Party is the best possible ruler for China, and ultimately that's what they want to stay in power. And they can't stay in power unless they're actually delivering some of the goods.
Okay, so let me flip the script then, okay? Because one could argue that you could get more in economic innovation from free speech. We've learned psychologically, if we teach our children to speak freely, they innovate, they go on and create Facebook or they make Apple Computer. If we inhibit their free speech, then these countries have a tendency to need to steal intellectual property. Why the insecurity about the openness? It's a vibrant, dynamic economy. We've learned that more innovation comes from liberalism. Uh, what am I getting wrong? Be Chinese for a second. Be a Chinese nationalist for a second, and tell me what I'm getting wrong.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, first of all, I want to agree with you that they do feel awfully insecure. And it's really strange. I mean, you take a look at some of their statements, the way that they bully like a small country like Lithuania, which they did a couple of years ago, or they bully a H&M, the fashion retailer, because they make the wrong statement. You know, it does look awfully insecure in all sorts of ways. They really punish a lot of comedians if they use the wrong joke. And so, first of all, it is an insecure place. But if I want to defend some of the aspect of illiberalism, maybe I would say that maybe the Silicon Valley model of innovation is wrong. And I speak to you as a person who spends a lot of time in Silicon Valley because I'm a part of Stanford. And the Silicon Valley approach, since you bring up Apple computers, is that maybe the way to get innovation is that we take Steve Jobs, we throw him into a garage, we send some LSD after him, and somehow an Apple computer comes out of the garage. But someone actually had to make that Apple computer, and that Apple computer, that iPhone, isn't being made in the U.S. anymore. All of it is being made in China, and so they are kind of able to wait for American entrepreneurs, really, to dream up really big ideas. Someone from something like Elon Musk or whatever, and they kind of learn these big ideas. They sort of guess that American companies are no longer very good at building these ideas because over the last 25, 30 years, the American manufacturing base has mostly rusted. It's been a lot of failures in aviation, as well as the semiconductors, as well as manufacturing broadly. And then they just wait for the geniuses to kind of hand over these great ideas into the public. And then they count on Chinese manufacturing prowess to climb all of these ladders that the Americans are laying out for them. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think you also bring this up in the book, and I want you to elaborate it on here if you don't mind. That's stuff that the U.S. can learn from China, but there's also things that China could learn from the U.S. And so, tell me about that reconciliation.
Yeah, well, I think that the US used to be much better at building monumentalist projects. I mentioned before the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hoover Dam, New York City subway stations. Um, Most of these projects were built about 100 years ago. And for basically, essentially since the 1970s, the United States has not built very many projects at all. Penn Station in New York is a gaping pit. The subways are pretty broken. There is like their bridges are collapsing. It just doesn't look very good. And I think that this is something that the Americans really ought to learn more from China. That people want a better level of public works. California, especially, is really bad at providing a lot of functional infrastructure, and I think that more Americans ought to have better infrastructure. So that's something that the Americans can learn from China, and I really hope that the Chinese, the Communist Party, can learn some degree of free speech from the U.S. I wish that there could be better protection of speech rights, better protection of property rights, that there could be more respect for individual people, because I think that Chinese can be really wonderfully creative, really wonderful jokers, great comics, and yet a lot of that is being strangled by the Communist Party because it just really doesn't understand what young people actually want.
Okay, so I mean, I think this is the thing, right? So if you were, since you brought up my age, Dan Wang, let me tell you about my
No, you did it
age.
yourself, man. Let's
All
talk
right,
about your
let
age.
me let me let me tell you about my age. So the CIA said, and I quote, in 1979, there's a period of long-term stability for the Shah of Iran. 3 months later, the whole thing exploded in revolution. The CIA said in 1985, and I quote, while the Soviet economy can't produce at the level that our economy is producing at, it is sustainable. There'll be a 25-year continued consolidation of power in the Soviet economy. And of course, 7 short years later, the thing was blowing up. Okay. And so the question is, because we look at things in life and we see this linear progression, Dan, and we think, okay, well, that's going to continue to happen. But is there some things going on under the surface in China that, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we may be surprised about politically? Is there a balkanization of the provinces? Is the young people that you're talking about that are using these VPNs and getting information outside of the control of the Communist Party? Are there things under the surface that maybe an analyst isn't picking up when they say, well, there's a period, they're going to make it to their 100th year, 2048 or 49 anniversary? Or is there something else afoot?
Yeah, well, you've convinced me, old man. The CIA kind of blows. So, I think that
Especially on
they're
stuff like that. They're probably good at other things, but not really good at predicting. That's for sure.
yeah. Well, let's see what their predictions are so that we know what's not going to happen. So, I think that I agree that these kinds of big surprises, these black swans, could always happen. But black swans are unpredictable by definition. And, what I would reason from is that, from my years of living there, that the regime has been highly capable, that they don't seem terribly weak, that they have been actually pretty good at responding to crises. I was living in China at the start of the COVID pandemic. Now, of course, they majorly messed up at the very start when they punished whistleblowers and they didn't control the pandemic effectively in the very early days. But after Beijing got on the case, they managed to have a zero COVID policy that for 2 years mostly kept the country, kept transmissions minimal, and kept the economy going for about 2 good years before they all messed up again. And so, I think that the regime looks pretty strong to me, that there is still plenty of economic growth available to it. Their per capita income is about one-sixth the level of American income. And so there's plenty of convergence that ought to be possible. And that the Communist Party has been pretty good at delivering the goods. Now, one could imagine that a lot of these sort of things collapse. I think collapse is always an option. But then I think, what they would be doing is to say, oh, well, let's do this exercise for the rest of the world. Does the United States look terribly strong? Well, Donald Trump is messing up a lot of different things. He's very disruptive. Does Europe look very strong? Well, populist right-wing parties are about to overrun the continent in a couple of years. Plus, they have no growth. And so, if we wanted to do this sort of, what could collapse, I would take it much more seriously to take a look at the entire world. And based on that, I'm not sure that the Chinese look like the weakest of the bunch.
So it's 2049. We are in the midst of celebrating the 100th anniversary of Mao's revolution, or is there something very different happening in China?
Well, maybe you'll be celebrating, Anthony, but I won't be. I think that if they
Okay, so you
are,
think there will be a celebration? I mean, again, I'm not certainly me personally. I'm certainly not celebrating that. And remember, I'm old enough to remember George Marshall going over there and trying to see if he could negotiate a peace before the full-on revolution started.
yeah, well, I mean, you must have been alive when, Herbert Hoover was trying to deal with the Great Depression. But, I think that, yeah, I think that there will be a celebration in China.
The Chinese Communist Party will still be running China 20 years from today.
I'm expecting that to be the case, and I'll bet you a cup of coffee that they're still going to be
Okay,
running the
well, no,
country then.
you're smarter than me. I'm assuming that will also be the case. But looking ahead, though, Dan, when you think about technology and infrastructure and state power, where do you see the greatest risk of conflict potentially between the U.S. and China over the next decade?
The island nation of Taiwan could be an obvious powder keg, as well as these islands around the South China Sea, because the Chinese are very clear in saying that Taiwan belongs to Beijing. They really want to seize the island, and they also claim some degree of sovereignty, as well as possession over all sorts of these smaller islands across the South Pacific, which are also contested by other countries, including the United States. And so, if Xi Jinping ever decides to seize Taiwan, then the American president has to make a choice whether they defend this island, which is a democracy that is hanging off essentially pretty close off the coast of China, whether the United States really needs to send a lot of forces to defend this a democracy that is pretty pro-American. And maybe so, maybe not. But if the troops do actually sail over there, then that is a pretty obvious potential for conflict between the two. Otherwise, I don't think that the American troops really want to occupy China. They're not going to seize Shandong province, and the Chinese don't want to seize Oregon state. What would they do with Oregon? But when it comes to these minor, islands in the Pacific as well as Taiwan, that's the more obvious trigger.
And so the American president, so a likelihood in the next decade that there will be a military move. Obviously, they're trying to. I mean, they would like the same thing to happen to Taiwan that happened to Hong Kong or happened in Macau, right? They would just want a natural absorption. But barring that, do you think that they would move militarily in the next decade?
I think that they are going to have to think about what the American president is going to do. And so maybe that's more a question for you, Anthony. You've spoken to him more than I have. What do you think he would do in that sort of situation?
Right now, I think his military advisors are telling him that it's a toss up and that therefore he has to stay the course in terms of this strategic ambiguity because in a toss up and recognizing what happened with Ukraine in terms of the crippling sanctions on Russia, et cetera, that the Chinese would, they're long term thinkers. There'd be no reason for them to move while there's a toss up. If there was a uh, flip, if we became less supportive of the Pacific region, if we moved the fleet, example, things like that, or we retracted from the region, which I don't predict we're going to do at least in the last 3 years of the Trump term, then I think it becomes a little bit harder to defend the island. So to me, as long as the party thinks that there's a toss up, I don't think they're going to move on that island. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but remember, you had 20 miles to go from England into France, and that's 80 years ago. It was a very hard amphibious trek to make that assault. It's an 80-mile strait, so it's 4 times the size. And yes, we have better technology today, but that's also a very rocky, difficult terrain, Taiwan. It's not a flat surface. There's a lot of complication there, and those, of course, are very, very smart people, and they've been preparing for this for, almost a century now in terms of defending that island. And what we've learned from the Ukrainians, that people they'll dig in and they'll defend their land to the death. So it's not clear to me that the Chinese are going to move on it, given everything that I know from a military perspective. But if you think I'm wrong, push back.
No,
I
that all
don't
makes
think
sense to
Trump.
me.
I don't think Trump. I don't think he gives two shits about that island. Okay, other than the fact that there's semiconductor chips being produced there, and the Chinese don't have the compromise on Trump that the Russians do. So he's not as afraid of Xi as he is Putin. But the flip side is that as long as he doesn't need to do anything, he won't. It'll be up to the American military to stay fortified in that region. Again, remember, you're talking to an internationalist. You're talking to somebody that sees the world from a balance of power perspective. I'm not a tripolar MAGA Trump supporter. I'm somebody that believes that we need to embolden the West to protect its interests because we're in the minority, my friend. Okay, we have 5.9 billion people living under some type of totalitarian regime. So we'll have to see. All right. Well, we're down to the last. So if you've listened to this podcast before, we come up with 5 words. I'm going to say the word from your book. I want you to give me a sentence or two. Okay, you ready?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So Dan, I say the future. I say future. You say what?
I say that Americans and Chinese both believe in the future, whereas Europeans and Japanese seem to have a sense of optimism only about the past.
Okay, it's interesting, and I agree with that. Okay, it's very astute observation. Engineering. I say the word engineering. You say what?
I think that the Chinese want to engineer the physical environment. They want to engineer the economy. They are also engineers of the human soul.
I say the word breakneck, the title of your book. You say what?
I think that the Chinese are really moving forward at breakneck speed. They are able to move fast and break things. They're also able to move fast and break people.
It's a very powerful book you've written, my friend. Okay, I say the word America. You say what?
I think that it is pluralistic, um, dysfunctional, and needs to get a lot better than today.
You need a more rational policy, less of this bipartisan policy, less of this polarity, I think is what I would say. Okay, I'm going to give you the last word, and this is the last word. I say China. You say what?
I think that it is a fabulously interesting place that is also growing politically darker year by year.
Okay, listen, I think it's an incredible book. I'm very grateful to Professor Ferguson for giving me this book. The
Me
title of the
too.
book is Breakneck. It's China's quest to engineer the future. It is a brilliant exposition of what is going on, and it's a real examination of the facts. Dan, I think you've written a great book. I hope people go out and buy it, and I appreciate you joining us today on Open Book.
Thank you very much, Anthony.